Picture this. You are sitting in a dimly lit room somewhere in Las Vegas, surrounded by people who love you, and you have been carrying a secret so heavy that it has quietly shaped every single song you have ever written, every performance you have ever given, and every tear you have ever cried on a stage in front of millions of people. The cameras are always on you. The world has always been watching. But nobody, not one single person outside of your inner circle, has ever truly known the whole story. And then one day, at 39 years old, after more than 2 decades of dancing, singing, heartbreak, and hiding, you finally decide that the world deserves to hear the truth. That is exactly where Bruno Mars finds himself right now. And what he has confirmed has left the entire music world completely speechless. Before we get into what Bruno finally said, and why the timing of it has shaken fans to their core, you have to understand who this man really is. Because most people think they know Bruno Mars. They know the sequin jackets. They know the hip shakes and the retro microphone stands. They know the voice that sounds like it was borrowed from another era and gifted to a boy born in Honolulu, Hawaii. They know the smile that could light up an entire arena without a single spotlight. But the real Bruno Mars, the one who existed long before the Grammy stages and the Super Bowl halftime shows and the Las Vegas residency, that Bruno is a story that most people have never fully heard. And it is a story that changes everything about the way you listen to his music. His real name is Peter Gene Hernandez. He was born on October 8, 1985, into a family where music was not just a hobby or a career path. It was the air they breathed. It was the language they used to talk to each other and to the world. His father, Peter Hernandez Sr., was a Latin percussionist who had moved to Hawaii all the way from Brooklyn, New York, carrying rhythms in his hands that had traveled through generations. His mother, Bernadette, was a singer and dancer of Filipino and Spanish heritage who performed traditional Hawaiian music with a grace and a warmth that everyone who ever saw her remembered for the rest of their lives. Together, this extraordinary couple ran a family show called The Love Notes, and little Peter was put on that stage before he was old enough to even fully understand what a stage was. He was performing Elvis Presley impressions at age 4 years old, standing in a little white jumpsuit, moving his hips and curling his lip with such uncanny accuracy that audiences genuinely could not believe what they were seeing. People would drive from across the island just to watch this tiny boy perform. He was not mimicking Elvis for fun. He was studying him. Even at 4 years old, something in Peter Hernandez was paying attention to the way a performer commands a room, the way a single gesture can make a crowd hold its breath, the way a voice can carry something beyond just a melody. He was learning the craft before he even had words for what the craft was. That family show was not just entertainment. It was the most important school he would ever attend. Every single night, little Peter watched how his parents read a crowd, how his aunts and uncles controlled a room full of strangers, how a simple melody played at just the right moment could make someone sitting in the audience feel something they had buried inside themselves for years. He was absorbing every note, every move, every pause before a punchline, every breath before a big chorus. He had absolutely no idea then that he was being trained for something far bigger than a family show on a beautiful island in the Pacific. He was being trained for the whole world. But childhood for Bruno was not all spotlights and applause and adoring audiences. His parents divorced when he was still young, and that quiet earthquake that shakes a child's world in ways that adults can never fully see or measure left marks on him that would later pour out in his music in ways that were both beautiful and deeply heartbreaking. He moved to Los Angeles as a teenager, carrying the dream with him and almost nothing else in his pockets. The city was enormous and cold in ways that Hawaii never was. He was just another kid from somewhere else who thought he was special. And the music industry, that glittering and brutal machine, was not particularly interested in making him feel welcome. He signed with Motown Records at 17 years old. Think about what that means for a second. 17 years old, signed to one of the most legendary record labels in the history of American music, the home of Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder and Diana Ross. And then he was dropped, before a single song was released. Before a single fan ever got the chance to hear his voice on the radio, or hold one of his records in their hands. He was told no before the world ever got the chance to say yes. And he was 19 years old when it happened, sitting in a city that did not know his name yet, having to figure out what comes next when the biggest opportunity of your life disappears before it ever really begins. That is a specific kind of heartbreak that most people never talk about because it happens in private. There is no public breakup to explain. There is no visible wound to show people. You just quietly go back to your apartment and try to figure out who you are when the thing you built your whole identity around suddenly does not want you anymore. Bruno was 19 years old and already learning one of the hardest lessons the music industry teaches. That talent alone is never enough. That being extraordinary does not protect you from being overlooked. So he did what the truly resilient always do. He stayed in the rooms. He kept writing. He began crafting songs for other artists, sitting in studios for hours and days and weeks, pouring his heart into music that would make other people famous, while his own name stayed buried in the small print at the bottom of a credits page. He helped write Just the Way You Are, a song he would eventually record himself and take all the way to #1 on the charts. He helped write Nothing on You for B.O.B. He was everywhere that mattered and nowhere that anyone could see. The invisible genius behind songs that were making other faces the faces on the magazine covers. And through all of that, through every rejection, and every late night in a studio, and every moment of wondering whether any of it would ever pay off, he kept a smile on his face, so wide and so warm and so seemingly effortless that nobody ever thought to look too closely at what might be living underneath it. That smile became his armor. That charm became the wall. And for a long time, it worked perfectly. When the breakthrough finally came, it came like a wave that had been building for years just beyond the horizon. Just the way you are launched him into a level of fame that even the people around him were not fully prepared for. The Grammy Awards. The Super Bowl halftime show in 2014, which is still talked about as one of the greatest solo halftime performances in the history of that stage. The Uptown Funk collaboration with Mark Ronson that sat at #1 for 14 consecutive weeks and reminded an entire generation what it felt like when a song was just undeniably, unstoppably good. Then 24K Magic. Then the Las Vegas residency that turned him into something close to a permanent institution in that glittering city. Bruno Mars became one of the best-selling music artists of all time, with over 230 million records sold worldwide. He won 15 Grammy Awards. He headlined stages on every continent. He became one of those rare artists that genuinely transcends genre, generation, and geography. Your grandmother knows who Bruno Mars is. Your 10-year-old cousin knows who Bruno Mars is. A taxi driver in Tokyo knows who Bruno Mars is. That kind of universal recognition is not something that happens by accident. It is the product of real and extraordinary talent meeting years of invisible hard work. But here is the thing about building that kind of life. The bigger the public version of you becomes, the more pressure there is to protect it. The more carefully constructed the image, the more terrifying it feels to let anyone see behind it. And Bruno Mars, who had spent his entire adult life giving the world the most polished, most joyful, most perfectly entertaining version of himself, had been quietly paying a price for that performance that nobody on the outside could see. The rumors started swirling years ago. Quietly, at first, the way these things always begin. A whisper here, a comment on a fan forum there. People who had followed his career closely noticed that Bruno, despite being one of the most famous and beloved artists on the entire planet, had never really spoken publicly about his romantic life in any meaningful or lasting way. He dated model Jessica Caban for over a decade, and their relationship was kept so far away from the spotlight that many of his own fans barely knew it existed. Even by the standards of celebrities who value their privacy, Bruno was operating on another level entirely. And the more successful he became, the thicker those walls seemed to grow. Then came the Las Vegas residency, and something began to shift. Not dramatically at first, but for people who had been watching him carefully for years, there was a different quality to the performances. Something raw, something that felt less like entertainment and more like confession. Songs that had always seemed like universal love stories began to feel like they were being sung about something far more specific and far more personal. And the fans, the ones who have paid the closest attention across the longest stretch of time, started quietly putting pieces together. The gambling story broke in 2023, and it was enormous. Reports surfaced claiming that Bruno Mars had accumulated somewhere between $50 and $75 million in gambling debt at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. The report suggested that his extended residency in the city was not purely a matter of artistic choice, that the shows were, at least in part, a way of working down a debt so staggering it would have swallowed most human beings whole. And the silence from Bruno and everyone around him in response to those reports was absolutely deafening. No angry denial, no tearful press conference, no carefully worded statement from a publicist. Just silence. And silence, as anyone who has ever studied human behavior will tell you, carries its own kind of weight. But as shocking as the gambling story was, it turned out to be only the first layer, because underneath it, buried deeper and kept closer to the chest for far longer, was something even more personal, something that Bruno Mars had been carrying since long before any Las Vegas debt, since long before any Grammy was ever placed in his hands, since long before the world ever learned to love the name that was not even really his name. And at 39 years old, having reached that particular point in life where the masked people were begin to feel genuinely too heavy to keep lifting every single day, Bruno finally began letting the truth surface. The biggest loss of his life came on June 1st, 2013. His mother, Bernadette Hernandez, passed away suddenly from a brain aneurysm. She was 55 years old. And she was not simply his mother in the way that word sometimes gets used lightly. She was the woman who placed him on his first stage. She was the voice he heard inside his head when he was searching for the emotional center of a song. She was the reason he understood from the very beginning that music was not just organized sound, but something that lives inside the body, something that travels through the blood from one generation to the next. She was the origin of everything. Bruno was 27 years old when she died, and he was in the middle of a world tour. He had to keep performing. He had no choice. He had to keep walking out onto those stages, keep smiling that enormous smile, keep dancing and singing and making tens of thousands of people feel the joy that he himself was nowhere close to feeling. He had to keep being Bruno Mars, even as the most important person in his entire world was suddenly, permanently, irreversibly gone. And there is something about being forced to perform your happiness in public, while privately falling apart, that changes a person in ways that are very difficult to ever fully come back from. He almost never speaks about her publicly. But when he does, even in the smallest fragments of interviews scattered across years, you can hear exactly where the weight lives in his voice. That raw and aching edge that has nothing to do with vocal technique, and everything to do with a man who learned to put his grief into notes because he had no other safe place to put it. People who have followed him carefully for the longest time say that his mother's death did something to Bruno that no level of success, no amount of applause, no number of Grammy trophies sitting on a shelf has ever been able to fully undo. And now, at 39, he is starting to say that out loud. Not in a polished interview, not in a rehearsed statement, but in the honest and unguarded way that a person speaks when they have simply decided that carrying something alone is no longer worth the cost. He has talked about the way grief does not follow the neat timeline that everyone around a grieving person seems to expect it to follow. About how you can be standing on a stage in front of 80,000 screaming people and still feel a loneliness so complete and so total that it takes your breath away. About how performing can be simultaneously the thing that keeps you alive and the thing that makes the pain sharper. Because the moment the lights come down and the crowd goes home, you have to stop being the performer and go back to being the person who is carrying everything that the performer was built to hide. And then there is the question of identity, the one that has followed Bruno Mars quietly through his entire career without ever being fully addressed. He grew up in a world that desperately wanted to put him in a clearly labeled box. The music industry tried to make him a reggae artist, then a pop artist, then an R&B star, then a funk revivalist, then a nostalgia act. He has never fit cleanly or comfortably into any single category. And the reason is as simple as his own family history. He is the product of everything at once. Filipino, Puerto Rican, Ashkenazi Jewish, Spanish, Native Hawaiian. He is a living, breathing collection of musical histories and cultural inheritances that stretch across oceans and generations. And for most of his public life, he let the music speak for all of that without ever sitting down and telling the world what it actually felt like to exist at the intersection of so many different identities in an industry that has always been far more comfortable with simplicity. He has now confirmed, through conversations that have gradually made their way into public view, that navigating that complexity was never as effortless as his performances made it look. That there were rooms in the music industry where he felt like he did not quite belong anywhere on the map. That his heritage was celebrated loudly and publicly when it was useful to someone else's marketing strategy and quietly set to one side when it was not. That the experience of being many things at once in a world that constantly asks you to pick one is its own slow and particular kind of exhaustion. And for someone who poured so completely of himself into his art, being reduced to a demographic category or a marketing checkbox was a wound that sat quietly in him for a very long time. What makes this entire moment so significant? What makes the timing of Bruno's gradual openness feel genuinely important and not just like another celebrity story? Is the fact that 39 is a very specific age for a reckoning like this one. It is the age where the stories that people have spent their whole adult lives telling themselves about who they are and why they do what they do start to feel less convincing in the quiet hours. It is the age where the armor that people welded onto themselves in their 20s starts to feel less like protection and more like a cage. Where the reasons for keeping things private and controlled and managed start to matter significantly less than the cost of carrying them completely alone. His fans have responded in a way that says everything important about why this man has remained one of the most beloved figures in popular music across nearly 2 decades of an industry that chews people up and spits them out at a remarkable speed. Not with shock or judgment or the cruel curiosity that celebrity confessions so often attract, but with something that looks very much like recognition. The kind of love that says quietly, we always knew something was living in there beneath all of it. And we are grateful and honored that you finally decided to let us see it. Old interviews are being rewatched across fan communities with completely different eyes. Old performances are being looked at again and understood in entirely new ways. Moments where the emotion in his voice always seemed to go somewhere deeper than the song required are now making sense in a way they never quite did before. Because Bruno Mars has always been telling the truth. The truth was always right there in the music, available to anyone who knew how to listen for it, beneath the sparkle and the showmanship. And that is the thing that separates him from artists who are simply technically brilliant. He takes the things that are too heavy and too raw and too private to carry in ordinary life, and he transforms them, in that singular way that only the greatest artists can, into something that makes other people feel less alone with their own heavy, raw, private things. That is not a skill that can be taught in any studio or any music school. It is the product of someone who has felt things so deeply and so privately for so long that the only place in the world that ever felt safe enough to put any of it was into a melody, into a lyric, into 3.5 minutes of music that strangers would carry with them for the rest of their own lives without ever knowing exactly where it came from. At 39, Bruno Mars is not falling apart. He is not unraveling. He is doing something that is in many ways far more difficult and far more courageous than anything he has ever done on a stage. He is choosing deliberately and at real personal cost to be known. Not the version of himself that was so carefully and so brilliantly designed to be loved by absolutely everybody, but the real one. The one that was shaped by a Hawaiian stage and a mother's laugh and a Motown rejection letter, and a grief that packed its bags and moved in permanently, and a city of lights that sometimes felt more like a trap than a destination. The one who has been singing the truth about all of it from the very beginning, and is only now, finally, letting us know that the truth was always in there waiting for us to find it. And perhaps, when you think about it, that is the most Bruno Mars thing he has ever done, saving the most important and the most revealing performance for last. The one where he steps out from behind everything he built and finally, for the first time, plays himself. So tell us in the comments below, did you always feel like there was more to Bruno Mars than the world ever got to see? And which one of his songs hits you completely differently now that you know more of the real story behind the man who wrote it? Drop your answer down below, hit that like button, and make sure you subscribe. Because this is one artist whose story only becomes more powerful and more layered the more of it finally comes to light.